10 Years a Nun by Hesba Stretton. This is recorded to celebrate the 10th anniversary of LibriVox. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. You wish to hear in full detail an account of my sojourn and adventure in a French convent, of which you have only received the incomplete and unsatisfactory outlines. I went to France, as you know, against the wishes of my family and friends, having accepted a situation in a school there as English teacher. It is enough to say about that school that no decent English girl could have stayed, so utter was the dirt, discomfort, and barbarism pervading it. I was compelled to leave it, but I was extremely reluctant to quit France without accomplishing my object, which was to perfect myself in the language, more especially as my friends had objected to the enterprise from the first. I travelled back, however, from the interior to a small seaport town, from which the transit to England was easy, and during my journey I took counsel with myself and calculated my remaining stock of money, amounting to a little more than £26. I had made up my mind before I reached the terminus, and there I inquired if there was any English consul in the town. Certainly there was, at least a vice-consul, and for the small consideration of half a franc the polite porter conducted me to his office. I entered it with some diffidence, and confronted 3 clerks, seated at the orthodox high desks, who bestowed upon me the orthodox clerkly stare. The vice-consul was summoned, and proved to be a German, who spoke English and French with equally amusing blunders. However, he was all kindness, and after due deliberation he asked if I should object to go into a convent. I felt a slight shock at first, but a few minutes' thought decided me to go, and I said so. In that case, he replied, he could be of service to me, for without doubt he could obtain my admission into a convent in the town on the morrow. In the meantime he would see me safely lodged in a hotel for the night. I must pass over my night alone in a foreign hotel, though there is a good deal I might tell you about it. In the morning the vice-consul came as appointed, and told me that I could be received into the convent for £2 a month. The terms suited my means, as you see, and I accepted them gladly. So I gave £20 into his hands, asked him to call each month and pay the sum agreed upon. I went with him to the convent in a mood of cheerful alacrity, with my sense of the romantic fanned to a flame, picturing it as a grey, solemn ecclesiastical building, standing in a vast antique garden, surrounded by high massive walls. Judge then of my disappointment when I found a new brick building, not unlike an English workhouse, presenting a flat front of 4 stories to a dull street, on the other side of which were a few gloomy old houses that seemed injured by the fresh paint and red brickwork of the upstart convent. The vice-consul and I entered a bare waiting-room, something like those of prisons and hospitals, which was divided by a grille of iron bars about 3 inches apart, behind which was a nun, fat, rosy, and about 40 years old, who was jabbering in rapid French to a peasant woman on our side of the grille. We were summoned to the upper end of the room, where Madame la Supérieure waited to give us an interview, and she and I looked keenly at one another through the grating. I saw a face comely and shrewd, and bearing the unmistakable traits of a lady under the white coiffure which concealed her hair. The fine lips might have been chiselled in marble to express rule and decision, and the eyes, hazel grey, instead of the common dark brown of French eyes, had a directness and penetration of gaze which I could only bear with difficulty. "Mademoiselle is not so young as I supposed," she said to the vice-consul. "She will not submit to the strictness of our rules. We permit our boarders to go out but once a month, and then under supervision. Her letters will be read before she sends them out or receives them, and she will not be allowed to hold any private conversation except with me or one of the sisters." The rules were rather too strict to be quite agreeable, but I had made up my mind to go into that convent, especially as the elegant and polished accent of Madame struck upon my ear as altogether the best French I had ever heard. "I can submit to the rules," I said, and she smiled approval. "But will you let me see this gentleman once a month, when he comes to discharge my obligations to you?" "Certainly, yes," replied Madame graciously. "And if any of my friends," I continued, "should come here to see me, you will not refuse them? It is not probable, but it might happen." "Without doubt," she answered, as affably as before. I bade the vice-consul good-bye, almost affectionately, for he was my last friend in the wicked world I should quit when I entered those barred doors, and I felt something like tears in my eyes, but I was bent upon going through with my purpose, and the convent seemed the only home open to me in that strange land. The Superior called a nun to show me to my chamber, and the door of the waiting room was locked the instant we had passed through it. I felt that, like Esau, I had sold my birthright, the right of freedom. This feeling grew as I traversed the exquisitely clean but bare, empty passages and apartments of the interior, with doors locked or bolted, near each of which sat a sister with keys fastened to her girdle. The lower windows, towards the street, were barred, a thick iron cross forming a portion of the bars, as if that blessed emblem were a token of captivity instead of liberty. But in my attic in the roof, where I felt sure I should be locked up at night, the casement opened wide, like doors, letting in the full freedom of light and air. I soon grew reconciled to the locking up, and the everlasting sound of the keys ceased to grate upon my ear. I became used to the confinement also, and felt that it was adventurous enough to stand at my open window and look out upon the beauties of the land and sea, or upon little street pictures which I could see like tableaux vivants in the queer little slums and alleys of the town which my high position commanded. The sisters, with the exception of the Superior and one other, were as uninteresting a set of women as you can imagine. They were the ordinary Dorcas ladies and tract distributors and district visitors of our Protestant churches, playing at religion as nuns in a convent. Taking them in the mass, they were narrow-minded, self-satisfied women, mostly middle-aged, fond of gossip, and inclined to nurse their little ailments, though they could not have the luxury of a doctor unless they were dangerously ill. The Superior was a lady by birth, intensely proud and ambitious, covetous to an excess, but admirably qualified for managing her large and troublesome family. I saw but little of her, for she had no time to give to an insignificant person like me. But was there no ideal nun among them? Certainly, a slender, graceful woman, about 30, with the traces of great beauty left in her faded face. She moved solitary and sad amidst the self-satisfied and stupid sisterhood surrounding her. My education was committed chiefly to her, and my conversion, as I learned later. There were many other boarders, but all French and all Catholic, and consequently less interesting than an English heretic. Sister Catherine attached herself to me. At first our conversations were necessarily limited, but I made rapid progress in the language, and though I could not expound and defend our Protestant doctrines, I could soon perfectly comprehend all that was said to me, and I listened with a laudable attention until Sister Catherine was persuaded that I was near conversion. This impression at once increased her attachment to me, and at the same time threw the Superior off her guard as to the nature of the confidential intimacy which was established between the sister and me. It was at 2 or 3 different times that I learned the history of Sister Catherine, which is simply as true as that I am now writing it. When only a girl of 15, she had been sought in marriage by a cousin of her own, to whom her parents' sole objection arose from an old quarrel existing between them and his father. It was the old story of the feud between the Montagues and the Capulets, with the added bitterness of blood relationship. The cousin had prevailed upon Hortense, her baptismal name, to fly from her home with him, and as it is simply impossible to contract a secret marriage in France, he had brought her to this convent, 100 leagues from her father's house, and placed her in it as a boarder until she was of age to serve her parents with a legal notice that she intended to unite herself in marriage with her cousin, Pierre de Fourville. The Superior was made their confidant, and as there were still 6 years to wait, Pierre, to mislead the vigilance of the parents as well as of the police, resolved upon filling up the long interval with foreign travel, which would enable him to correspond with Hortense without danger of discovery. This correspondence made happy the life of the cloistered girl who was not fretted by convent rules as I was, and who had, moreover, her religious duties to occupy some of her time. But at last, it is an old story, Pierre's letters ceased to come, and one only, a brief note, written by a strange physician in an Italian city, announced his death from cholera. The heart of Hortense was broken, and her health failed her. For 4 years she remained in her chamber, as much invalided in mind as body, during which time her father died, and she came into the inheritance of a 3rd portion of his property, amounting to nearly £7,000. By his death she became one of the wealthiest inmates of the convent, and before long her mind, weak and wavering, became impressed with the duty of taking the vows among the sisterhood. I could fancy easily the shrewd, subtle, covetous spirit of Madame la Supérieure pressing towards the rich prize of £7,000, and the small chance that the enfeebled and disconsolate girl would have against her. It ended by her taking the veil at the age of 21, the time when she should have married Pierre de Fourville. I suppose that Sister Catherine was not more unhappy than Hortense de Fourville would have been. Everything was settled now, all was ended. Her whole life henceforth was to trickle slowly through the narrow channel of convent routine. But when 5 years, nearly 6 years, had passed, the tranquil triumph of Madame met with a violent check. Pierre de Fauville was no more dead than Hortense herself, but he had received a pious and mournful letter from Madame, communicating to him her death and burial, and inquiring if a monument should be erected to her memory. He had come to the convent, been under the same roof with her who was heartbroken for his own supposed loss, seen her grave, and fled again to dissipate his grief, if he could, by travel more distant still from his native country. 6 years after the profession of Sister Catherine, he had returned home, and discovered the fraud practised upon him by the convincing proof that his cousin had inherited her share of her father's estate. He made his appearance at the convent gates, and demanded to see her whom he had confided to the motherly care of the Superior 12 years before. Madame's false heart quaked within her. Here was a man who had been faithful for so many years, 9 of which had been given to the memory of the dead, a man who would not forget, who would not be consoled, who saw no charms in any other woman. He was a troublesome visitor. It was useless to tell such a man any more lies. Yes, his Hortense was living, but she was the spouse of heaven, no longer Hortense, but Sister Catherine, separated from him for ever. He was not permitted to see her, even at the grill, for the Superior had no wish that she should discover the falsehood. Monsieur de Fauville persisted in coming again and again to thunder at the convent doors, and made a scandal in the town. He could not be put down or silenced. He went to the bishop, and when he could not or would not do anything for him, he wrote a pamphlet disclosing the whole case. For this he was prosecuted and imprisoned for 6 months. But upon regaining his liberty he set to work more energetically than before, and appealing to the civil law, he demanded that the mayor should see and interrogate his cousin. The mayor paid an official visit to the convent, and saw Sister Catherine, but in the presence of the Superior. He informed the astonished nun of her cousin's continued existence, and in the same breath inquired of her if she had taken the vows of her own free will. Shocked and bewildered, she murmured a few inaudible words in reply, which Madame interpreted to the mayor as an avowal of her free and unbiassed will in taking the veil, and the interview ended. The civil law could do no more. If Hortense de Fauville chose to be a nun, no one could interfere to prevent it. I listened to this story with intense interest and a profound admiration for Pierre. What a prince among men must he be who could maintain a constancy like this! I wished that heaven had given me such a man. I looked at the pale and faded face before me, and tried to fancy what the girl of 15 had been, with whom he had parted in the grey gloom of the convent walls. I asked her to describe him, and she gave me a girl's Valentine-like description. Fine eyes, black hair, moustache, and white hands with rings upon them. He was her beau cousin. It was all she could say. "And do you love him?" I asked. A shiver ran through her frame, but her dim eyes flashed, and her pale cheeks flushed a little. "Ah, yes, I love him," she whispered. "I fear I love him better than the angels or the blessed saints, better than the Sainte Vierge herself." She uttered the last words in a tone of candid horror, as if forced to speak the worst. "Of course you do," I said emphatically, "and you have no more right to be a nun than I have. You are one by fraud, and not by choice." "Yes," she answered, weeping, "and I wish I had said so to the mayor, but I was all confused and bewildered. Oh, if I were you, I should never rest till Pierre knew that I loved him still, better than anything else. I think how sad he must be to find that you are grown indifferent to him." "But what can I do?" asked Sister Catherine. That was the question. Something ought to be done, if it were only to assure the unhappy but faithful Pierre that his Hortense was not so senseless as to prefer a convent to himself. But how to do it was the difficulty. Nobody who has not tried it can have an idea of what it is to be perpetually under lock and key and surrounded by spies. Our only chance was to write to Monsieur de Fauville and direct the letter to his chateau, whence it would be sure to be forwarded to him. But how to get that letter to the post office? I racked my brain with schemes, but it was not till near Easter that a moderately prudent one presented itself. The convent garden was on the other side of the street, with a subterranean passage beneath by which we reached it. It was full in sight of several houses, from the windows of which we were often watched. It was nothing more than a long, narrow patch of ground, with a straight walk all round it, and a little chapel in one corner where the perpetual adoration of the cross was maintained by our nuns. On the side beyond it, and nearer to the houses, was the priest's garden, but again beyond that was a garden belonging to a house which was generally let out in stages. A few days before Easter my ears were greeted by English laughter and English voices coming to me over the intervening enclosure. I urged Sister Catherine to write her letter immediately, and I added to it a note to the effect that Monsieur de Fauville might send someone to the convent under pretext of seeing me, with a message from my home, but I left it with him to contrive a way of conveying a letter to us. These letters ready, the old difficulty of getting them to my country people still remained. It was impossible to enter into any communication with them from the garden, because of the perpetual adoration. I fell back upon an old accomplishment which had slipped into disuse. I have 3 brothers who took upon themselves my early education, and amongst other boyish acquirements had made me an adept at flinging missiles at a mark. My sole chance lay in casting my letters from my attic window into the garden of the English. Take the trouble to think of my difficulties. My window was high, certainly, and gave me so much vantage, but before me lay the street, the nuns' garden, the priest's garden, and beyond that the one my aim must reach. They were all narrow places, so that the distance was not absolutely great, but there was the terrible chance of missing my throw, and of our letters falling into either of the 2 nearer enclosures. Every day I picked up stones stealthily in the garden, and every evening during vespers I practised flinging them from my window. The priest's melon frames were broken, and a sister narrowly escaped being struck by a pebble. But a watch was set for mischievous lads in the street, and no suspicion fell upon me. I resolved that as soon as I had thrown 12 stones without missing into the English garden, I would risk my precious packet to my skill. It was done at last. 12 largish stones had descended into the right patch of ground, and with hands trembling with excitement I wrapped my packet in a paper, upon which I had written, "One of your countrywomen implores you earnestly to post this letter." My hands trembled, I said, but that would never do. I am not ashamed to own that I covered my face with them, and prayed God to give me strength and steady nerves to take a right aim. And then, standing perfectly still for a few seconds, to make sure that I trembled no longer, I whirled my weighted packet out of my hand. The short time it takes for a stone to skim through the air seemed several minutes to me. I felt persuaded it would fall into the priest's garden, and all the dire consequences rose vividly before me. But I saw my missile just clear the farthest wall and drop into its right place, and I sat down on the floor crying hysterically, partly from thankfulness and partly from reaction. I felt certain all would be right now, but I did not cry the less for that. Well, about 15 days after that, a messenger came to me that a friend was waiting to see me at the grill. My heart throbbed quickly as I went. Was it really one of my own people, weary to see my face, and unsatisfied by the formal and scanty letters I was compelled to write? Or was it a confederate of Monsieur de Fauville? Sister Catherine fainted dead away when she heard the message, and I left the school in commotion, though happily no connection was perceived between the cause and effect. I found the Superior in bland conversation with my visitor when I entered. It was a lady, a stranger, who explained to us that she had met Monsieur mon père at Paris, and having mentioned that she should be passing through this town, he had asked her to do him the inestimable favour of seeing me with her own eyes and assuring herself of my health and happiness. There could be no doubt of either, she added, with a polite compliment to Madame, and she had another commission to fulfil. Monsieur mon père had entrusted to her 2 Easter eggs, one for Madame and the other for me, and with a smile of the sweetest blandness she put both into the Supérieur's hands. They were small enamelled and painted boxes of the shape and size of an egg. Madame's contained a banknote for 200 francs, and mine simply a chocolate bonbon. It was impossible to suspect anything, for I was not yet a suspected person. The chocolate egg contained a most ardent letter from Pierre, imploring Catherine to free herself from her yoke at the end of her next 5 years. I learned then, for the first time, that in France the convent vows are only legally binding for 5 years, and must be renewed at each expiration of that period. At the close of the next October, Catherine would have been 10 years a nun, and she might assert her right to be free. All my care and half my sympathy vanished, for nothing could be plainer or easier than the course lying before her. But Sister Catherine was troubled with a tender, or as I think, a weak conscience. To my great disgust, she positively wished to betray the whole to her confessor. I made her comprehend, with some trouble, that I should be forthwith turned out of the convent, and she would be left to fight her battle alone. She kept silence, but her conduct was so odd that suspicions were aroused, and she was placed under strict surveillance. I had no opportunity of conversing with her, and I was in great doubt of her strength of mind to effect her own deliverance. She suffered the pangs of martyrdom during those last few months, from the Superior, the confessor, and her own conscience. Each day I saw her grow paler and more wretched looking, and the last trace of beauty left her wan face. Other doubts respecting Pierre began to haunt me. October came, and my friend the Vice Consul paid me his monthly visit. I told him and the Superior that I wished to leave the convent on the 28th. I saw her colour change, and her keen eyes fasten upon me, as if she would read to the bottom of my heart. It was the day on which Sister Catherine would either renew her vows or demand her freedom. For though she should have made her profession at the fête of St. Catherine early in December, her precarious health at the time she took the veil had hurried on the ceremony. Madame had strong suspicions of both of us, and during the next fortnight poor Catherine led an awful life. We Protestants do not know what it is. Every threat possible of this life and the life to come were hurled against her, but to my surprise she remained firm. I only knew it, however, by the mute and sad language of her eyes whenever they had a chance of meeting mine. They spoke of a constancy worthy of Pierre. The morning came upon which I must quit the convent, and I had not been able to see or communicate with Catherine. Early in the day I was summoned to the Superior's presence, and she bade me farewell with the most chilling frigidity, telling me I must go at once. I begged to stay till nearer evening, but she answered sternly, "No." My box was already gone down to a hotel on the quay, so I had no excuse for lingering. I was turned out at the convent door like a servant discharged for dishonesty, and I heard its strong lock turned between me and Catherine. I felt perfectly bewildered. After a while my common sense, and my habit of managing for myself under perplexing circumstances, served me in good stead. I went to the Vice Consul for the small residue of my money, but I told him nothing, for I knew he would be afraid of meddling in such a matter. From his office I went to the hotel, where I arranged for leaving my luggage for a short time, first making up a bundle of clothes which Catherine would want if she came out of the convent. Then I hired the sole conveyance I could procure, a sort of covered cart with no door at the back, but a seat behind the driver, to which we had to climb over as well as we could. This char à banc I hired for the day, and bidding the driver go as far as the corner of the convent street, I told him to wait there, resolving to keep the convent doors in view until 6 o'clock, after which they never opened on any account. It was one of the most wearisome and anxious days I ever passed. Even the polite French were curious, and showered questions upon the driver of the char à banc, to which his general reply was, "It is an Englishwoman," with a grimace more eloquent than words. There were 2 entrances to the convent, one for ordinary use, the other an arched, thick, black door, opened only on great occasions. As they were situated on different sides of the building, I was obliged to pace to and fro to keep watch upon both. But at evening near 6 o'clock I saw the black door of ceremony opened narrowly, and a poor creature thrust out into the profane and unsheltered streets as if against her will, for she made a faint gesture of seeking readmission, and then cowered down against the closed portal as if she was some poor dove flung out of her nest. I ran to her, for it was Sister Catherine. With great trouble I lifted her, more dead than alive, into the back of my cart, and bade the driver take us to a village about 7 miles distant, which I knew only as being the residence of one of our boarders, for I felt that it would be foolish and cruel to keep Sister Catherine in this town, where her story would ooze out in some way or another. I had posted a letter to Pierre in a letter box near the convent, imploring him to come to us immediately at this village. I shall never forget that ride. The conveyance either had no springs or broken ones, and the seat in the back was so high that only our toes could reach the floor. Added to this, the roads were rough and up and down hill, and the horse had an uneasy tread. Catherine, who had had no carriage exercise for 16 years, was restored to her senses and distracted from her terrors by the unusual motion. The char à banc conveyed us to the village auberge, and I took a room there for the night, which had already closed in. My nun was as helpless and frightened as a child, and obeyed me like one. As soon as we were fairly alone in our chamber, she fell upon her knees and began telling her beads, or rather would have done so had not her rosary been taken away from her, with her other insignia of sisterhood, upon the remembrance of which she fell into a profound swoon, and after recovering from it, spent the rest of the night in speechless tears. I did not feel happy myself. I reflected that my friends did not know where I was, and I might fall ill and die, and be for ever lost to them. I was almost as frightened as Sister Catherine herself at this thought, but I did not fall ill. I fell asleep instead, and woke refreshed, with more vigour for action, and a renewal of sympathy for my nun, who had tried my patience a little the evening before. The next day passed in altering one of my dresses to fit Catherine, and in reading over and over Pierre's ardent letter, which she had seen but once, as I had kept it for safety in my possession while we were in the convent. She grew more reconciled to herself, and was content to say her prayers without a rosary. Our room was very quiet, overlooking the orchard where pyramids of apples were piled under the trees and perfumed the autumn air with their scent. There was nothing to scare or startle her, and tomorrow Pierre might come. The day passed well, but during the second afternoon the landlady made her appearance, and intimated that we must leave, with an air of decision which gave me clearly to understand that she meant to turn us out. "Why?" I inquired. She would not say why, only we must go, and go at once. It did not occur to me that I should have any trouble in finding another lodging, and I bade her leave us alone while we prepared for our departure. Catherine's dress was finished, and I had bought her a dark-coloured hood at the village shop. She put them on, and appeared as a wan, meagre, worried woman in poor circumstances, who had all the grace and dignity trodden out of her. Again, some very poignant doubts of Monsieur de Fourville's satisfaction crossed me, and I wished heartily that he would come, or that we were both back at the convent. Yet I was really fond of Catherine, and very sorry for her. We went to nearly every house in that village, and were refused shelter in each. But after I had caught a glimpse of the convent priest, I was no longer mystified. We must make the best of our way, while the daylight lasted, to some other village, and get a place of refuge for one night before we were hunted on again on the morrow. I said nothing to Catherine, but I took the broad road leading from the village, and shook off the dust from my feet as I left it. It was getting near the sunset, and all the afternoon the sky had been gathering stormy-looking clouds, torn at the edges, as if some strong upper current of wind was rending them into fringes. I talked to Catherine gaily, for at every utter extremity my spirits rise into almost boisterous buoyancy, and I was brought up so close to the unknown future now that I could not guess where we should be or what we might be doing in another hour. On and on we walked briskly, Catherine glad to fly from the inhospitable village, and I anxious to reach another before nightfall. The road was very solitary, with but few passengers, as most French country roads are, and for the first 2 or 3 miles I did not care to inquire where it would lead us, lest immediate persecution should track our steps. We came to no village, and the few farmsteads we passed, while it was light enough to see them, looked too dirty and miserable to invite us to seek shelter there. We went on in hope of finding something better, until the dusk darkened rather quickly into night, from the thickness of the clouds which overspread the sky. I did not know how far or how long we had walked, but I felt an extreme fatigue overtaking me. I could no longer see Catherine's face, nor had she spoken for some time, and I dared not ask her how she felt. The wind began to whirl past us in sudden gusts, and howled dismally among the trees which crowded the hedgerows and made our path darker. There was a vague ominous roar of a ghostly tone somewhere in the black distance, whether of wind or sea I could not tell. We strayed somehow or other out of our road, and lost ourselves in a thick wood, which might prove to be one of those old forests of indefinite extent where wolves find a lair, which still exist in France. Suddenly, without an instant's warning, a torrent of rain fell, pattering upon the autumn leaves with a multitudinous sound, and the sky grew blacker every minute, though we could still distinguish the ebony trunks and branches of the trees, enclosing us as in a net on every hand, and we could just make out, in a small hollow of an old trunk, a tiny white image of the Virgin in a bower of artificial white roses. Catherine sank down on the mass of dead leaves before it and began to pray, while I stood by, listening to the howling of the fitful wind and the deep, constant roar of the sea, if it was the sea, and shivering under the pelting raindrops. There reached us at last the faint note of a bell tinkling far away. "I am going to die," said Catherine solemnly. "I hear the bell of the convent I have forsaken. It is the sign of approaching death. O Holy Mary, Holy St. Catherine, have pity upon us." "Don't be foolish," I said rather crossly. "It cannot be the convent bell." "I have heard it for 16 years," she answered, "and I should know it among 1,000. I am going to die in this dreadful place." "But why should I hear it if it is you who are going to die?" I asked. "Come, let us make another effort to find a way out of this wood." Nerved by despair, Catherine dragged herself up, and I drew her arm within mine. We found a path which soon brought us to the end of the coppice and into a lane, along which we pressed eagerly. I was resolved to insist upon being received into the first house we came to, and before long a line of light, glimmering through some persiennes, shone upon us. I groped at the gate for a bell handle, and rang such a peal upon it as the inmates had not heard for a long time. The window was quietly opened, but not the persiennes, and a voice from behind them said in English, "Who is there?" I was never so near fainting in my life. It seemed as if some angel from heaven was speaking a celestial language, and I had scarcely courage to answer. When I did, I do not know what I said, but there was a run downstairs and a rapid unfastening of the door, and hospitable rush to the gate. It was still raining heavily, but in a minute we were standing within doors, and two elderly English ladies were gazing in unmitigated amazement upon our bedraggled and miserable aspect. I glanced at Catherine's abject appearance, and feeling myself safe from the perils of the night, I burst into a fit of almost hysterical laughter, in which the two ladies soon joined. They told us the next day that they had inhabited France during some years, dwelling in this little villa just outside the town where our convent was. Catherine and I had returned by the very nearest route to the place from which we were flying, and it was indeed the convent bell we had heard in the wood. We learned that our story was known, to the great mortification of the Superior, and it was then the topic of the day in the little town. But as we did not wish to be seen, and the ladies were anxious not to embroil themselves with priestly power, we remained secreted in their house for some time, after dispatching a second letter to Monsieur de Forville. But just realise, if you can, my anxiety when day after day passed by, and no faithful Pierre arrived. I began to be gravely troubled, for what could I do with a renegade nun on my hands? As the slow days of waiting consumed themselves, her conscience, like most consciences in times of distress, grew outrageously sensitive, and she tormented herself and me without ceasing. I thought of my father and mother, and wondered what they would think if I had to carry Sister Catherine back with me to our English home. I went as far as a cowardly wish that I had never meddled in the loves of Pierre and Hortense de Forville, and my brain grew almost fevered with wondering why he did not come. But all's well that ends well. Pierre never received my first letter, posted in the letter-box near the convent, and our second and a third, which we wrote in our impatience, were sent after him to Rome, and hearing from us, he started off instantly to come. He had concluded that Catherine's profession had been made at the fête of St. Catherine in December, and he had intended to be down in the town then, waiting to receive her if she quitted the convent. But all was right now that he had come. I saw him first. He was no longer a beau cousin, but a sunburnt, travel-worn man nearing 40, whose hair was tinged with grey, and his forehead wrinkled as much with trouble as with years. He looked like a rock against which many a rough billow and fretting wave had broken. But I liked him very much, and very gently I tried to prepare him for the change 16 years had made in his cousin. "She is always my Hortense," said Monsieur de Forville. Hearing that, I led him at once to the room where she was waiting for him. But don't tell me that he did not feel a great shock when his eyes first fell upon her, for he turned to me with a look of almost agonized interrogation. We had done our best in making a becoming dress for her, but she still looked a subdued, faded, gentle old maid, in the place of the bright girl of 15, half child and half coquette, whom he had last seen. The shock was not so great on her side, though she trembled and hesitated, and greeted him with the graceful curtsy that French women seem born to make. There was something very strange and sad in this meeting, something of pathos which I had not thought of beforehand, and I ran out of the room to hide my tears, leaving the lovers alone with one another. I thought Monsieur de Forville very quiet, and almost low-spirited during the evening, but Catherine every hour grew visibly younger before our eyes. Iron sharpeneth iron, so a man sharpeneth the countenance of his friend, says the Bible. How much more then does a man sharpen the countenance of a woman? It was droll to watch the convent frost thawing, and the innocent coquetries of the woman budding out, nay, bursting into full bloom in Sister Catherine. Her eyes sparkled, a delicate colour suffused her face, and her voice took a gayer and more musical tone. At last she laughed, a sweet, ringing, girlish laugh, as free from care as a child's, and Pierre started as if his ear had caught some magical tone. This was a creature more like his lost Hortense. That laugh had lived in his memory these 16 years. He bent down his head, and laid his lips reverently and tenderly upon her hand. We left town the next day, and, to appease Catherine's troublesome conscience, we travelled direct to Rome, where Monsieur de Forville had already done what money and influence could do to obtain for her the Holy Father's dispensation from her vows, which she declared to be essential to her happiness. The whole case was so plainly one of fraud that the kindly old Pope absolved Sister Catherine without difficulty, and gave her as a wedding gift a rosary blessed by himself, in place of the one she had forfeited in the convent. We journeyed back to Paris, where they were married as privately as possible, to avoid causing any greater scandal than was inevitable. Since then Madame de Forville has plunged into the gaieties of the gayest city in the world, and bids fair to become one of the leaders of fashion. There is but one hope left for her. After I have been home to visit my friends, I am to return to accompany them on a long foreign tour, which is Monsieur de Forville's passion. Both of them declare that I am as dear to them as a sister. My sole regret is that the Pope did not insist upon his beloved daughter, Madame la Supérieure, refunding Sister Catherine's dowry of £7,000. End of 10 Years a Nun by Hesba Stretton. Read by Beth Thomas.